Good evening, everybody. My name is Michal Sventek, and I'm a board member of the apolitical student organization called the Slovak Students For Liberty. For our 5th anniversary, we have something very special prepared for you, and it's a talk, an event, today's event, with Mr. Johan Norberg, who comes from Sweden, is a classical liberal, like many of us. He's a historian, an author of many great books, such as, for example, 2001's In Defense of Global Capitalism, and then 2016's Progress, 10 Reasons to Look Forward to the Future. He has a new book that came out in 2020, in September. It's called Open, the Story of Human Progress. He's also a lecturer, and I recommend one of his lectures on YouTube. It's called Lessons from Sweden. And it's a Neil B. Freeman guest lecture that is really, really good. And I have to say, Mr. Norberg, you have wonderful presentation skills. So I am sure that our guests today will have a great time. I should also mention that Mr. Norberg is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. And I would like to say a big thank you to Mr. Norberg for taking his time and joining us today. So today's session, its name is The State of Liberty Worldwide. It's very interesting because if we just take a look at the last 5 years since Students for Liberty started, year 2016 was very special and I suppose still very real in people's memories when it comes to, for example, Brexit or the American elections. But many things have happened since, polarization is growing in between people in different nations. We have the newest COVID-19 restrictions. And then, of course, which is a positive thing, around the world, more and more countries, and in the US, more and more states are now legalizing recreational use of weed, marijuana. So that's a big plus for liberty worldwide. Anyways, to give you a bit of a structure of this talk, of this session today, Mr. Norberg's lecture will be around 45 minutes, and then the last 30 minutes of the session we'll have for Q&A, for your questions for Mr. Norberg. You can put them either into the Q&A section here in Zoom, if you're on Zoom, or in YouTube comments, if you're watching this session from YouTube. So, without further ado, I would like to say thank you again, Mr. Norberg, for coming and joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Thank you for the kind words, and I hope you can all hear me well. If not, I hope someone will yell at me and write stuff and send me messages about that. First of all, hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. And to Students for Liberty, congratulations on your first 5 years. Happy birthday. There is supposedly an old Chinese curse saying that may you live in interesting times, because that's supposedly the worst thing you can wish for someone. And you certainly have lived in interesting times. These 5 years have been packed with events. Let's just go back in time and think about what has happened during these few years. We had, for example, a peace deal in Colombia. It's easy to forget because you don't remember, you don't think about the wars that are not happening, but the ones that are still in motion. But it's an important thing. It's a war that killed more than 200,000 people. At the same time, neighboring Venezuela collapsed, and economically, politically, turned into a very ugly dictatorship with an enormous exodus of people. Some 5 million people, more than 10% of its population fled the country. In Africa, Mugabe, the dictator, was ousted. Myanmar's military persecuted Rohingyas, and then its own people with a military coup. In Saudi Arabia, we had Mohammed bin Salman taking over, reforming its culture a little bit, and also waging a terrible war in Yemen and murdering dissident Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul. In the US, suddenly we had Donald Trump as president, who started by abandoning trade deals with Pacific countries and with Europe, starting trade wars around the world, and even refusing to accept his own election defeat a couple of months ago. In Europe, we had Brexit. Britain left the European Union, which changed the European Union in several ways, often for the worst, I'd say, because Britain has often been a friend of decentralization and open markets. It's that rare event that can actually make both Britain and the European Union worse in a way, because it seems like Britain has fought very hard for things like being able to implement state subsidies for particular companies, picking winners and other things, working hard to abandon some of the ideas that made Britain great once upon a time. In China, we had the elevation of Xi Jinping thought into the constitution and forcing civil servants to look at their cell phones and constantly updating their skills in coming up with new great Xi Jinping proverbs and ideas, and also using that new power to centralize authority even further and to squash the liberties of Hong Kong. At the same time, as Mikhail pointed out, we had the legalization of marijuana in ever more countries, ever more American states. It is happening right now. It is happening in many countries around the world, a great event. And then, of course, there was 2020, a year that we'd rather just forget about, because we got the pandemic and all the lockdowns and the human and economic disasters that followed from that. We've seen in these 5 years great progress and great regress. The first 4 years, around 25 million people were lifted out of poverty every year around the world. Child mortality rates were reduced by 15%. Spectacular global health success. But then we had the pandemic. We had aversion behavior, people avoiding one another. We had restrictions, lockdowns, and more than 100 million people were thrown back into poverty. So a great 4 years, and suddenly we just crashed into a wall and saw some terrible human consequences. So what's the net effect of all of this? If the topic of the day is the state of liberty worldwide, where are we? Where have we been coming from, and where are we going next? Well, let's avoid the particular stories and the anecdotes and the zooming in here and there, and instead let's look at broad data on human freedom. So why don't we go to the Human Freedom Index of the Cato Institute, compiled by Ian Vasquez and Fred McMahon. And looking at the last 10 years, we can see up until 2018, that's the latest data we have. Looking at economic freedom, looking at personal freedom, political freedom, there has been in these 10 years a slight increase in economic freedom from an already high level. So it's been quite impressive, even though we should remember the data ends before the pandemic. Things have happened since then. But we've also seen a slight decline in personal freedom, especially when it comes to things like religious freedom, when it comes to the rule of law. Around the world, in lots of places, we've seen it in Asia and Latin America, but we've also seen it in Europe. We've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Poland, we've seen it in Turkey. So there is a worrying sign that things are not going well everywhere, even though we should remember, again, it's from a fairly high level when we think about this historically. In 1990, around less than 50%, around 45% of the world's population lived in democracies, and it increased in the early 2000s to 64%. It's a dramatic improvement. But since then, it has stagnated quite dramatically. And just to look at one data point, the Slovak Republic is in the Human Freedom Index at place 36. Place 36 of the world's 162 countries that the Human Freedom Index has data from, which means that if you are not happy with the freedom in the Slovak Republic today, please remember that 126 countries out of 162 are even less free than the Slovak Republic right now. And that, I think, tells us something about where we are and how much further we have to go. When you go to Freedom House, the American democracy watchdog, they have an index of political and civil liberties. And the worrying thing is that ever since the Great Recession, basically in 2007, 2008, in every year, more countries have regressed than made progress when it comes to political and civil liberties. It has happened mostly in the Middle East, in certain Asian countries, in China, in Russia, and so on, but it is happening everywhere. On every continent, you can see that more countries are regressing right now than are making progress. So the question is, what's going on? We thought we had reached an important level of freedom and that we would continue to make progress. What has happened in these last 5 years? I think that we've seen new threats from abroad and from within. We've seen certain authoritarian countries, China and Russia, where the leaders have made themselves basically dictators for life, and they've become more aggressive domestically and clamped down on individual liberties and on economic freedom. But they've also been more aggressive abroad, partly when it comes to military action, Russia into Ukraine, annexing the Crimea. When it comes to China, dismantling the liberties of Hong Kong and increasingly threatening Taiwan. But also becoming better at using our tools against us, the tools that have been developed in more open countries where we've seen better technologies and communication strategies. Dictators have become better at using that against us to build new alliances and to undermine other countries that are more open, and at building international alliances, funding authoritarians in other places, no questions asked, and investing in places where it doesn't make economic sense to do it, but political sense if you want to create alliances and strengthen authoritarians in certain countries, from Syria to Venezuela. But also, we've seen a new threat from within over the last, I'd say, basically since the Great Recession, since 2008. A backlash against liberties, against globalization and free trade, which I think is related to a loss of cultural self-confidence in open places. You could see it most obviously in a president like Donald Trump, who just did not care very much for open societies and the liberal democracy of and America's founding principles, and instead praised China and Russia for their coercion and undermined institutions back home by undermining rule of law, by abandoning ideals of open markets and free trade. And also Western democracies in Europe and in around the world that have combated the pandemic with authoritarian measures, with very harsh lockdowns and shutdowns. At one point, half of the world's population, more than half of the world's population, lived under curfew and house arrest. And borders were closed, and liberties of association and of trade were curtailed. And we've also seen a longing for self-sufficiency, of not being dependent on international supply chains, but rather we should have all the production that we need back home, which I happen to think would be the most counterproductive thing that we could do if we worry about a new potential crises, because most crises are local and regional by nature, whether it be bad weather, floods, epidemics. They attack areas that are linked culturally, geographically, economically at the same time, which means that if we have all the production, the whole supply chain in that area, the moment that we start to enter a lockdown, everything collapses and we can't depend on the rest of the world for any kind of supplies and inputs, which would be a disaster. But unfortunately, that doesn't stop politicians from trying. And behind these things, behind these new threats, I think lies a sense of crisis and of fear, which I think is related to things like Europe and North America, thinking there are new geopolitical risks. We don't run the world anymore. There are new powers entering, and that happens. There is a relative decline that must happen. If the rest of the world population is bigger and if they make advances culturally, socially, economically, then relatively speaking, we won't be running the world. More business models, technologies, and ideas will come from new places. But unfortunately, this results in a declining cultural self-confidence, where we begin to challenge our own model and think that perhaps this kind of openness, our liberal democracies, our free markets, our open societies aren't that good because others are making more progress. This is the great fear that I have of fear itself, this fear of the rest of the world, because oftentimes historically that results in a kind of a societal fight or flight instinct. We get terrified about the world, so we try to flee from that world by erecting walls, building tariff barriers, and trying to be self-sufficient in our economy, in our society, in our culture, or to pick fights with scapegoats, with minorities, or with other countries. It's very much part of human nature. Oftentimes, historically, we've seen this in times of crisis, and this is really what my book Open, the story of human progress, is about. How historically we've created progress based on openness. Openness to new ideas, new experiments, new innovation from all sorts of places. But we tend to undermine it in times of crisis, because then we get frightened and we long for the strong man or the big government to protect us against a dangerous world. And the dark irony is that this is exactly what undermines this openness, and therefore also undermines this progress. This is why the great civilizations of history collapsed. And if I had to mention one particular area, one particular psychological predisposition that makes openness difficult to us, it is the fact that we do not understand the world as the mutual ability for mutual gain that it is. We think that Adam Smith only happened to other people. The great insight that it's not from the benevolence of the baker that I get my bread, but from his own self-interest. The idea that the world is a zero-sum game is the great myth that launched 1,000 fallacies and mistakes and stupid policies that destroys our world. Because when we think that everything is a zero-sum game, well, then it's all about picking your team, your group, your collective, your tribe, your party, your nation, and then try to fight against all the others. And that's exactly how to shut yourself off from all the experiments, all the knowledge, all the technology, all the goods and services that others can contribute with. And the problem is that we're up against ourselves. We've seen the enemy, and it's us. It's our own psychological predisposition. As I tried to explain in Open, in the book, we are double-natured. We are created for cooperation, for trade, for exchange. We've always traded. Even the first humans had long-distance trade of getting materials from us 300,000 years ago, from as far away as 88 kilometers away, constantly trading, exchanging, making use of the ideas and the resources of others. But most of the time, we did this. We cooperated and exchanged within our band, within our tribe, within our group, which means that we always were a bit suspicious about the others 88 kilometers away. And especially in a dangerous world out on the East African savannah, if the others showed any kind of sign of not being loyal to us, not being trustworthy, we had to get ready to fight or flee, to eat or be eaten, because the alternative could be that we were destroyed. So we're very sensitive to us and them. We're very sensitive to tribes. We're very sensitive to where people fit into our social hierarchy, and if there are signs that someone belongs to another team. Because this world of open societies, of free markets that create wealth and innovation for all groups at the same time, that's new, at least to the extent that we could see it in our own life. This has happened over the last 200 years. This happened after the Enlightenment, after the Industrial Revolution, suddenly after having had stagnant living standards for 5,000 years. Then suddenly, in just 200 years, we've reduced extreme poverty around the world from almost 90% to 9% today, from having life expectancy at around 30 years to more than 70 years in just 200 years. So it's brand new. Think about it. If the whole history of Homo sapiens, of humans, is 300,000 years, and if we were to condense those 300,000 years into 24 hours, well, then the 200 years when almost everything happened is the last 60 seconds. It's the last minute. And we should all be grateful for the fact that we happen to live within those 60 seconds so that we can see this rapid improvement of living standards. So that's where all the great things come from, except our instincts, our attitudes, our predispositions, and many of our belief systems. They come not from the last 60 seconds, but from the previous 86,400 seconds. And they lived in another era, without rapid innovation, without free markets for mutual gains. So people rarely saw an improvement of living standards within their own lifespan, which meant that if they saw someone who was more successful, who made more progress than they did, they were right to be suspicious because they probably stole it from them. They probably took the best land or stole their resources. So it made sense to be suspicious and hostile. Unfortunately, it doesn't make sense today in a world where, in the places where we have even imperfect, safer property rights and freedom of association and of trade, no deal ever happens unless both parties think that they get away from it better off than they were before they entered into it. That's why we have this weird phenomena where we both thank one another in the grocery store. I thank them and they thank me when I've bought something there, because we've both made each other better off. In that kind of world, it doesn't make sense to think that someone who's making rapid progress is a threat to me. On the contrary, if they accumulate more knowledge, if they come up with technological innovations, if they produce new goods and services, it's an ability for me, a greater offering, an ability for me to improve my own life. But unfortunately, my brain doesn't agree with that, because it comes from those previous 86,400 seconds. I still think that they are ripping me off, they're exploiting me, they are bad people, they're capitalists, greedy capitalists who are making a profit on my expense. So the belief that the world is a zero-sum game is unfortunately always there in our mind, or at least in our reptilian brains somewhere. So it's easy for demagogues to constantly stir up hostility and suspicion against other groups, to tell us that, look, it's them, the rich, or that minority over there, or that other population on the other side of the border. They are making rapid progress. Don't you think that they did it on your expense? And then it's very easy to end up in a situation where you begin to undermine the freedom to associate and to trade and to be open based on that. Because if it is a zero-sum game, their win is your loss, and you have to fight back. And that's what every demagogue and collectivist and authoritarian is doing constantly, trying to make us fear one another. Because if we fear one another, we're sitting ducks, we're easy prey, and suddenly we wish for the safety of the tribe and of the strong man who can protect us against the others. So this, I think, is one reason why we're in a difficult era right now. We've made amazing progress, the fastest progress that the world has ever seen. But at the same time, there are strong collectivist movements who are trying to tear it all down, because that's their way to gain power. And I think that the problem is that this climate of ideas has shifted towards closure and more authoritarianism. We already had it there, but the pandemic has sharpened this even further, because then we get even more afraid and we wish even more for government protection. And I think we can see that specifically how the climate of ideas has changed by looking at who is implementing these policies right now. We have collectivists and populists of the left and of the right, but it's not always them doing the damage. It's often the centrists, the moderates, the technocrats. The last thing that the Buy American rule was strengthened in the US, which says that the US public sector has to buy from American producers, even if the price is worse. So it's something that loses American taxpayers billions of dollars every year. That was not sharpened in the last few months by Donald Trump. It was sharpened by Joe Biden. When France was at the early stage of the pandemic, was not just implementing an export ban on personal protective equipment, face masks and gloves and what have you. It was not Marine Le Pen or a nationalist like that. It was President Macron who did it, not just implementing an export ban, but even confiscating personal protective equipment that was just traveling through the country en route to another place, to Spain and Italy and places that were suffering more. When vaccines are banned from being exported from Italy, it is not a nationalist populist like Matteo Salvini who does this. It's the technocratic Prime Minister Mario Draghi who is implementing this vaccine nationalism, which undermines supply chains and threatens the reputation of Europe of being an open place for doing business and of cooperating against health threats. And right now, what the European Union has done to deal with the crisis is given itself more power to turn itself into more of a transfer union, the new big recovery fund of 750 billion euros. It's an attempt to hand money over to certain governments, not those who suffer the most health-wise, or to help them to roll out vaccines or anything like that, but just to help them with their budget shortfall because they've been stagnant for a very long time. When the centrists and when the moderates, when the technocrats implement policies like that, it's time to be worried, because it tells you that the climate of ideas is slipping through our fingers and towards something else. And I fear that this will intensify the tribal struggles between countries about who gets which funds, who has to pay for it, who gets the vaccines, who doesn't. It will strengthen international conflicts, and it will force more countries to be more nationalistic and protectionist. And so that's one thing I worry about. It doesn't help that we've seen this dramatic rolling out of government subsidies of 0% interest rates, a massive increase of the money supply, of liquidity everywhere, which might result in inflation and a financial crisis next, because we know that those kinds of perfect storms might also result in more government intervention. So now I've sounded a little bit like a pessimist. I'm sorry about that. That was not my intent, but I got carried away. But this doesn't mean that it's hopeless. It doesn't mean that the future is bad just because there are strong forces against freedom and openness right now. We've been in worse situations before, and we got through this. Just a little bit of perspective. In 1975, the US, the American envoy to the United Nations, was Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And he was worried in 1975, because back then, at the height of the Cold War, the Soviet Union was strong, and it was not just occupying Central and Eastern Europe, it had expanded into Vietnam, into Cambodia, into Laos. Latin America was ruled by military dictatorships. Countries like Greece, the Philippines, Chile, and Uruguay had been taken over by authoritarian forces, and India was experiencing a period of dictatorship. At that time, Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote that democracy, and now I quote, increasingly tends to the condition of monarchy in the 19th century, a holdover form of government, one which persists in isolated or peculiar places here and there. End of quote. And he concluded that democracy has simply no relevance to the future. And at the same time, in the 1970s, Willy Brandt, the previous German chancellor, he predicted that Western Europe had only 20 or 30 more years of liberal democracy left in it. So there you go. And obviously now we know that just at that moment, we're on the threshold of the biggest breakthroughs ever of human liberty, of the dismantling of dictatorships and of closed societies, because of brave people in Central and Eastern Europe tore down the walls. Latin Americans and Africans pushed against their dictators and told the militaries to go back into the barracks and keep out of politics, because you can keep people down with violence, you can stir hatred between groups, but it seems impossible to vanquish the spirit, the belief in liberty that all of us also have. That's part of our nature as well. And it's ready to burst out at any moment with the right convictions and with the right inspiration. And as the old systems turn out to be morally and economically bankrupt. So it is in our power to change events. And we know that authoritarians know it. Because they, the dictators, they are afraid. They don't feel like look, I have it all made. Now times are great because I get to rule everything and be president for life. No, they're afraid. They're literally afraid of their own people and think that they have to silence them, that they have to poison them, they have to put them in prison and in labor camps. And that tells you that they don't believe that time is on their side. They don't believe that people are on their side. The dictators and the authoritarians, they know something that we often forget, that the future is in our hands, that nothing is guaranteed, but on the other hand, nothing is precluded. There's nothing automatic about progress and openness, but there's nothing that rules it out. It's all dependent on what we do. We have both sides within us. We are double-natured. We are open. We're also closed, depending on what we listen to, whether we listen to the siren song or if we listen to the better angels of our nature. And progress is possible if we learn and if we teach. If we study history and learn that the good old days aren't there back in history, but we are getting there if we continue to be open to surprises, to experiments, and to innovation. And if we learn about how openness has created progress, if we study economics and learn about how production and trade, that's not zero-sum. On the contrary, that's what makes it possible for us to go from destitution and misery for everybody to decent living standards globally. But also, if we learn that we can easily turn the world into a zero-sum game with protectionist and redistributionist policies. And we can learn about our default psychologies that tempt us to gloss over such facts and forget all about it. We can choose to apply our knowledge to understand institutions that make positive sum outcomes possible, and we can inform ourselves about how previous civilizations were lost because people didn't do that enough. We can do that, and we can teach others to look at those facts and to learn the same things. Just like you do, just like every student of liberty does, being a student of mankind, and therefore also being a student of liberty, because it's liberty that pushes us onwards and forward towards making more progress and creating better and more decent societies. Just like you do, just like you have done these last 5 years. And for that, I commend you, and I'm grateful for the work you've done, and I hope that you will continue to do the same thing onwards. I'd like to end with a quote from the US President Ronald Reagan that I think is relevant to this discussion when he presided over a peaceful transition of power between two political leaders and explained to people how rare and unique in human history this is, why we shouldn't take it for granted, why we shouldn't take liberty for granted, which I think is an incredibly important point. And he said this: on the broad page of history, what is taking place here is almost a commonplace routine. We are participating in the orderly transfer of administrative authority continuing fact that the people, by democratic process, can delegate power and yet retain the custody of it, because the power doesn't belong to a particular person or a particular president. It belongs to each and every individual, and they only delegate it temporarily, and then they are at liberty to take it back and delegate it to somebody else.
Right. So, Mr. Norberg, are you still with us? I think it froze the video just for a second.
Those in world history who have known freedom and then lost it have never known it again. End of quote. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk, and I'm really glad that we're able to end on a positive note, because nowadays it just seems that we hear everything negative from all around us. So we've gathered quite a few questions in our comments all around. So if I may start, I'll go with, and I apologize if I butchered the name, Mr. Jose Cordero, who says, as a Venezuelan self-exiled in Spain, how can we overthrow a criminal government who is willing to kill all local opposition without foreign help? I think that a problem of libertarian thinking is how to deal against evil when the evil power is bigger than the good power. What do you propose in such extreme cases like Cuba, North Korea, or Venezuela today?
Wow, that's a hi, Jose. That's an incredibly important question, and I'm probably the wrong person to answer it, because I think that classical liberal ideas and libertarian ideas, they have answers about what we can do about the climate of ideas, how we can wage an intellectual war against fallacies and mistakes about history, about economics, about politics. But when the other side just looks at you through the barrel of a gun, dismantles all liberties and threaten people with prison, with exile, with death, there's not much in our ideas that give you the answer on how we can deal with that situation. Then we've left the world of ideas and we're in a world of war. And I mean, that's exactly why classical liberals have always fought for those ideas, to avoid us ending up in that situation. What do you do when you end up there? Well, you can only give individual answers depending on, I think, individual situations. And some people, for them, the rational choice might be to go into exile and to leave, or to stir up opposition. If someone has influence, to stir up opposition within the institutions that have the levers of power. What I think is that, as you point out, if the world is just watching, I don't think that the world should just be watching. I think we've lost quite a lot of credibility in Europe and the US recently, because we've just been too relaxed about the evil that takes place in many places. And I ended with a quote from Ronald Reagan. One of his great points was that he took away the illusion of the dictators and authoritarians, that they were all just the same, like everybody else, not granting them the sanction, or the moral high ground, but instead saying that this is evil, this is bad, and thereby also giving some sort of support to the oppositional forces behind the Iron Curtain. Then we should do the same thing when it comes to Venezuela today. Personally, I think that this brutal dictatorship is bound to fall at some point or another. The important thing is, and if I'm thinking about what people of ideas can contribute, is to have an idea about what happens then, and try to change people's attitudes and ideas on how to make a transition to something better possible, rather than ending up in chaos or in another kind of dictatorship. So I think that even when it looks hopeless, continuing to struggle and fight for the right ideas is important. It's quite a lot of people who were actually behind the Iron Curtain, who ended up as influential people, prime ministers, presidents, ministers of finance in their countries, because they continued to have this kind of ideological principle dialogue, even though they were suffering from oppression. So those are my 5 cents, even though I know it's not satisfactory when the odds against are so vicious.
Thank you. The next question is, you spoke of the 2008 crisis as the latest source of stagnation or decline in freedom, as we have lost our cultural confidence. Was this confidence lost because of the recession itself or because of the governmental response to it?
That's a very interesting question. I think that there's always something in recessions that triggers this zero-sum attitude within us for obvious reasons. When the economy is growing and it seems like everybody's getting better off all the time, it seems like, okay, we're doing pretty fine. It seems like we're doing okay, that our model is not totally awful. But the moment we enter a recession, nobody can get better off without anybody else getting worse off. So it triggers this kind of zero-sum mentality, whatever happens. And but then I think that the government response was very bad in several ways, and I've detailed this in my book Financial Fiasco, about both what caused the crisis and what happened next. And the worst thing, I think, is that we have a way, which we've kept to afterwards as well, and we're doing it right now as well, to try to protect every failing business model. Every failed speculative endeavor is supported by the taxpayers and by central banks, basically, which in the short run makes it seem like, okay, now we've protected something that would have been bad if it fell apart. But it creates several problems. The problem is not really what it costs. The problem is what it buys. It buys, first of all, more reckless behavior, more moral hazards, because people will continue to take stupid risks and make stupid decisions because they know that if they fail, somebody else is going to bail them out. But also it enforces this zero-sum attitude, because then suddenly, after the financial crisis, so many people suffered. So many workers and entrepreneurs and businesses suffered. And yet the financial companies and banks and many powerful people seem to be doing quite all right, because they were too big to fail. So we had to protect them. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why we saw such a vicious hostility to ironically, to capitalism. It was not capitalism, it was capital. It was not free market capitalism, because capitalism is not just a profit system, it's a profit and loss system. And both parts of that concept is equally important, that you profit when you make good decisions and that you lose when you make bad decisions. If you don't lose, then you will never behave better, and you will continue to live off somebody else's expense, and that will make us all worse off, and we'll lose more of cultural and economic self-confidence.
That's a very good point. And I think now that you brought up, people blaming capitalism on these things, there's one, I'd say, very troubling trend, looking at it from a, let's say, young person's perspective. And that is that nowadays in the countries in the West, more and more young people idealize socialism. And it's something that, with other speakers, we tend to bring up as well, speaking about what are the solutions. And obviously, as a student organization, the solution should be quite obvious, more events, more education, and so on. So what are your thoughts about this trend, with young people suddenly finding that socialism to them is something very attractive for some reason?
Yeah, this is an important thing to think about and to combat, because every attempt historically to build socialist societies, even voluntary libertarian forms of socialism, have ended up in terrible failure. So why are people tempted? Well, they've seen something that they don't like, and the socialism is presented as the alternative. And I think there are two obvious reasons. And one is that who wouldn't want socialism? If socialism is getting stuff for free, getting a better, more comfortable life, and somebody else is arranging this, why wouldn't you be in favor of it? You would have to have a very strong libertarian conviction to be opposed to that. And this is the way it's often presented. And I think especially as a young student, and I've been a young student, so I know this, you still live in a world where you don't have to build the resources to sustain your life. And that's fine, because studying and accumulating knowledge, that's a way to do that in the future. But it means that, at least for me, it meant that I had less respect for the forces and the energy and the work and the risks that it took for people to build a wealthy, decent society that made it possible for me to get the kind of safe life that I led without working very hard for it. So I think this is a recurring phenomena in most young generations. It's easy to think that, wow, the whole life, the whole world, the whole society should be like this. And then I think something changes as you start to get into work life and you begin to realize that the world is a struggle for existence. And if you don't know that, it just means that somebody else is doing that work for you. And you might still appreciate that. You might still think that that's the right thing to do. But then it's more morally dubious, because it means that you are going to force somebody else to do all that hard work for you. And what we realize historically is that people work very hard not to do that in that case. And we don't see the risk taking, the innovation, the hard work that creates a decent existence for many people. The other thing that I think contributes to this appreciation of socialism, it just, again, that they've seen something that they don't like. They've seen real capitalism, the version of capitalism that we have after the Great Recession, for example, or right now in Europe, whereby it's not really free markets. It's more like oftentimes socialism for the rich, where you benefit the biggest and most influential businesses, those who have the most lobbyists. They get the protection, the subsidies, the privileges from the government, and others have to pay for it. And if that's presented as capitalism, well, I wouldn't want that. I want something different. And then it's a very small minority standpoint. It's not heard of very often that there is a real free market alternative. So then socialism seems like the alternative for lots of people. And that's one reason to be more loud from our side and to present the other alternative, I think.
Exactly. And actually, one of our members, when speaking about this exact question, when talking about this issue, she mentioned that sometimes the problem is that the term itself, capitalism, carries a heavy luggage. You know, with some people, it's obviously this, what some call crony capitalism, the corporate buyouts and everything, and the crisis. And then for someone else, someone perhaps like us, capitalism is also perhaps just two grandmas selling paprika and I don't know, oranges to each other at the market. And yeah, and I actually remembered a very good quote as you started your answer, also from Ronald Reagan, and that is, socialism only works in two places: heaven where they don't need it, and hell where they already have it. All right, well, but sorry, to move on to the next question, I like it. We spent some time talking now about perhaps the other side and perhaps what they're doing wrong, why we disagree with them, and so on. And so this question kind of turns it around, and that is, what would you say are some good libertarian arguments based mostly on emotions? We usually try to argument strictly on logic and facts, not facts and logic and facts. But people today don't seem to listen to that kind of arguments. So what would you say?
Yeah, we need something more. Perhaps we need better branding as well. Referring to the last question, yeah, perhaps capitalism isn't the best word. It sounds like power is being given to capital, which it really isn't. It's more like a term made up by our opponents. Quite the contrary. Those who have capital, they're in charge in other systems where those who are in charge basically run the roost. Where there are in free markets, it means that consumers and individuals are in charge, and capital has to go where consumers lead. Otherwise, they'll lose their capital, which is not the case if we have state socialism or some sort of crony capitalism, which is quite different. So I think that something about markets is a more relevant concept. It's and free markets, because that's about the voluntary meeting of minds and individuals, rather than the idea that it's all about capital. But yes, emotive issues. I mean, liberty in itself, the idea that the horizon is open, shouldn't that be the most powerful emotional argument ever for anything? I would think the idea that the horizon is open, the world is young, that we let millions of different ideas and experiments bloom, rather than having someone from the top down telling us what to do. You don't need to understand economics or theories of marginal utility or spontaneous orders to sort of to see that your heart beats a little bit faster when you think about that. And perhaps because we are so good on economics and we've proven our case, perhaps we sometimes forget the moral case. Perhaps we forget or tone down, at least, the passionate moral case that this is the first system, the first set of institutions in mankind's history whereby people don't get better off or solve their own problems by destroying lives and livelihoods and properties of others, but whereby you can only get rich by enriching others, because you always have to meet somebody else face to face, or at least numbers to numbers, and come to an agreement whereby both sides think that, yes, I was just made better off. That's such an extraordinary revolution in the relationship between humans that we should constantly be astonished by it. And I think that we should emphasize that a little bit more, that this is the one set of institutions that's not based on coercion and force. It's not just that it makes us better off, it's that it treats us with dignity as individuals in our own rights, with our own needs, ideas, ambitions, and respects that rather than destroys that.
Yeah, I agree with that. And personally, that's one of those things that inspires me, for example, is just that overall feel. Well, it's in one way it's a vision, in one way it's a feeling, and it's something that you get when you read very good books on the topic, I think. And perhaps coming from a post-socialist country and visiting the West and speaking with people and getting to know all the opportunities that we have now that we are free. So let me find another question. All right. Okay. This one is probably like an oldie for you, one that you've answered probably many times before. One of the guests here asks, How do you look at the relation between freedom and the rapid progress in modern-day Scandinavia, since a common left-wing argument is that there is socialism in Scandinavia and it is still very rich?
Yes, I get that question a lot. Whatever I talk about, people ask me, so wait a minute, you're from Sweden, tell us about Sweden. And I'm happy to do that, and I'm happy to repeat it because it's so important, because everybody has the wrong ideas about what really makes Nordic countries tick. Because they seem successful, right? It seems like they've created fairly decent societies with social harmony, lots of wealth. And yet they seem like they're socialists. How do you combine that if socialism doesn't work? Well, first of all, you would have to go back in time a little bit to realize that this reputation about Nordic countries being harmonious and wealthy, we had that in the 1950s. People wrote about how Sweden was the most successful country on the planet, the most successful system in the 1950s. And that's interesting because in the 1950s, we were successful, the fifth richest country or the fourth richest country on the planet by then, after having been one of the poorest European countries in the late 19th century. But the interesting thing is that in the 1950s, we didn't have a generous welfare state. We didn't have high taxes. We didn't have lots of regulation. Sweden had a smaller government with lower taxes than the European average and lower taxes than the United States in the 1950s. The public sector was spending less than 10 percentage point, more than 10 percentage point less than countries like Great Britain and France at that time. So apparently something else made us successful. And what was that? Well, it was the fact that since the 1850s, basically, classical liberal politicians had taken power from the aristocrats and from the king in Sweden. And the story is fairly similar in the other Nordic countries, but I'll talk about Sweden because I know Sweden best. They wrested power away from them and implemented a classical liberal free market revolution in Sweden, limiting government, lowering taxes, opening Sweden to free trade and free enterprise, implementing free immigration and emigration, and generally building some of the most open societies on the planet. And that created 100 years of very rapid economic growth. From having starved in the 1860s, suddenly Sweden was seen as the most successful country on the planet. And that's because we were one of the most free societies on the planet at that time. Only then, and only really in the 1970s and 1980s, did Swedish politicians say, look, we're already so wealthy, so why don't we just spend it all? Why don't we redistribute this? Why don't we regulate everything? And they started doing that. But that wasn't the start of our golden era. That was the end of it. That was the one moment in Swedish history since the 1870s that Sweden lagged behind every other comparable country and didn't create a single net job in the private sector for more than 30 years. And it was really our Atlas Shrugged moment. So big businesses, entrepreneurs, innovators, they left Sweden at this time. So, and it all ended in the early 1990s after an inflation and debt-fueled boom with a terrible financial crisis that almost destroyed us. For a moment in time, we had a 500% interest rate from the central bank to protect the Swedish currency because nobody wanted to have the Swedish krona. Not 5%, not 50%, 500%. And at that time, an insightful observer said that the experiment with democratic socialism simply doesn't work. There is no way to go but market reform because this is unsustainable, it is perverse, it is absurd. And that person was Kjell-Olof Feldt, and he was the Minister of Finance from the Social Democrats. And since then, there was a consensus from the left to the right to reform the Swedish economy and go back to a more successful model that we had before. So they lowered taxes, reduced government controls, regulations, privatizing companies, reforming social security, the pension system, implementing a school voucher system, things like that. We haven't done all the things that I would wish for in Sweden or in Denmark or in Finland, but the case is pretty clear that for a very long time, these were incredibly successful societies, and then they almost ruined it all, and Sweden almost destroyed itself. And that was the period that the rest of the world seemed to remember and think that we're still like those socialists. And then Sweden was reformed, and after that, Sweden has begun to outperform other Western European economies again after the reforms, because we reduced the size of government, not increase it. So that's the crash course in Swedish history. Sorry for taking up so much time about it, but this is an important part of history that many outsiders don't know about.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And I have to say, I was actually looking forward to this question as well, because as I mentioned before, I did view some of your lectures before, and this you also mentioned much more in depth, of course, in Lessons from Sweden in one of the lectures. So another question, which is somehow related, I'd say, because of course, Sweden and Scandinavian countries are often looked at from the US as the socialist paradises, and something similar, they say about the EU. So what would you say, looking forward, let's say 5-10 years, what do you think is the future of the EU? How is it going to go?
That's a very good question. And I think that the bureaucrats are still out there, and we don't know yet. There are two different forces within the European Union that are battling it out on what happens next. I happen to believe in the basic idea of the European Union, the idea of the four freedoms to move around freely, goods, services, people, and capital. If you have that, and then you have different sets of institutions and policies in different places, this is the Europe that I want, because then you maximize both human freedoms and the ability of productive forces to create, and you also maximize the competition, the institutional competition between different solutions in different places, and hopefully will imitate those who function the best. On the other hand, there are those in Brussels and in different national governments in Europe who think that the idea with the union is to standardize everything and to basically short circuit the idea of the four freedoms and to make every government the same in different ways, to standardize rules and regulations and perhaps even tax rates and perhaps subsidies by building transfers on the European level. And who is going to win out? Well, I think I'm very sad about Brexit, the fact that Great Britain left the EU because they were on the side of those of us who wanted more decentralization and openness within the European Union. So there is this risk that this strengthens the forces who want more centralization and even more protectionism, like we're seeing now after the pandemic. So there is that risk. On the other hand, I hope that the lesson that people draw from Brexit is that if you're trying to create too much of a one-size-fits-all for all these countries, you'll have more Brexits. You'll have more countries and populations who just don't want to do that, don't want to be subjected to that kind of regime, and they will leave. So I hope that it'll create some sort of restraint there. And I also hope on the margin that we can contribute. You and I to talk about how it's really the openness that makes Europe great historically and will do in the future. Which side is going to win? That chapter is not yet written. I think that all sides, both sides, are sharpening their knives right now. So it's an incredibly important time to be a European and to be involved in this discussion.
Exactly. We're slowly coming closer to 6:15. So I'd just like to ask, do you have more time, or should we perhaps do like one or two last questions?
Well, let's say 3 questions then.
3 questions then.
A compromise. Yeah.
All right. So the next question: how would you react to libertarians who are strictly opposed to US/NATO military presence around the world and cannot comprehend that authoritarian regimes, excuse me, will gladly fill that void if not filled? This is a more sharp question, let's say.
Yes. Yes, that is interesting. And this is an area where we've often had disagreements between European and American libertarians who don't want to shoulder the burden of financing the military defense of Europe, for example, whereas Europeans think that this is about our survival against authoritarian regimes in our vicinity. And personally, I'm more, being a Swede and constantly knowing that we've been under the kind of threat that we've been in from the Soviet Union and from Russia, and it is obvious that I have a certain sort of emotional attachment to the idea of building a Western alliance that comes to our defense. At the same time, I would say that I understand why Americans don't want to pay for our defense. You can understand why they had to do that while we still lived on an incredibly, when we were destroyed after the Second World War, when Europe lay in ruins and America had to shoulder more of the burden. Now Europe is rich, and I think that the fair compromise is that, look, I think it's in every liberal democracy's self-interest, in every open society's self-interest, to build alliances and actually pool resources, so that because we get stronger together, and it also stops, I think it makes it less expensive in the long run, because it means that the risk is smaller that somebody is going to take advantage of us and start those wars and incursions that would be dangerous. But I think that the fair compromise would be if Europe shouldered more of the financial burden, so that this is an alliance, but more an alliance between equals rather than America just subsidizing our defense so that we have more money to, I don't know, pay for agricultural subsidies and to pay banks who fail miserably in the next financial crisis and so on. I think we should chip in more than we've done in Europe for our own defense.
All right. Next question is a bit more, let's say, theoretical in a way. In your lecture, you use the analogy of the shopkeeper and customer, both of whom say thank you to each other, and who then represent the real power in our world. So would you then say that the power of government, therefore, in fact, is only a pseudo quasi-power? That's how it was worded.
Let's see. Could you please repeat that? Because I don't think I understood the whole question.
Right. The question, as you use the analogy of shopkeeper and customer, both of whom say thank you, who represent the real power in our world, would you say that the power of government is, in fact, only a pseudo quasi-power?
Right. Now I get it. Sorry for misunderstanding. Yes, I would. I would say that the government is it's impotent. It doesn't have any kind of power in itself. It can only, it cannot create, it cannot build things, it cannot get the economy going. The only thing it can do is to move things around by the use of force. It can stop people from doing things, and it can redirect investments and activities from one place to another, but it cannot create anything in itself. So it's, in that sense, it's powerful, but it doesn't have the power to really build and create and build decent societies. If there's one essay that I would recommend everybody to read, if you haven't done so, it's the 19th century French liberal economist Frédéric Bastiat, who wrote an essay called What is Seen and What is Not Seen, which basically explains the whole liberal worldview and then perspective on markets and of governments, pointing out basically that, you know, what lots of people think when the classic example from that essay is that somebody breaks a window, and then someone says, oh, that's great, because you give the jobs to the person who's going to fix the window, and that person is going to employ someone who, when he buys shoes, and the shoemaker, he is going to employ a butcher because he's going to eat more, and so on. And Frédéric Bastiat's simple point is that, yes, that is what is seen. That is what we can all see, because those are the consequences that are close to us geographically and in time. But there are also consequences that we don't see. For example, what would have happened to those resources if you didn't have to use them to fix the window? So, and if you did that, those resources would have been left to perhaps buy new shoes. So the shoemaker would get a job in any case, and then the butcher would get a job, and so on and so on. So the only thing that has happened is that you have a broken window. Nothing else has happened. And this is what explains why every time the government says that, look, I've done something. I created 1,000 jobs through this particular subsidy here. Yes, that's what's seen. But you don't see what would have happened to that money otherwise. People wouldn't have baked it into pies or hid it in the mattress. They would have invested it somewhere else, or they would have spent it on something else, and then that would have happened. So you've only redirected activity away from what people would have chosen themselves to something that the government chose. So the government is impotent. It doesn't create anything. It can only steer, command, and control, which is really just a way of neglecting our individual thoughts, needs, ambitions, and to replace the knowledge and thoughts of millions of people with the knowledge and thoughts of a couple of people at the top. And that's why it doesn't work.
Thank you. You put it real well. And I gotta say, that was one of the first books I've read on the topic, and it's really, really good. Speaking of books, we come to our last question, which I think will be most enjoyable. As I see, you have an impressive collection behind you, and one of our viewers actually complimented in the comments. So, do you have a favorite book, perhaps, besides your own books, obviously, that you'd like to recommend to us and our viewers?
Yeah, that's a good question. And thanks for the comment about the bookshelves, by the way. Bastiat is one of them. Anytime when you feel like economics is boring or difficult, read Bastiat, because he's the most brilliant communicator that our side has ever seen, and creates those stories and expressions that you remember and can use again and again. When it comes to other stuff, I just mentioned the two thinkers that I think have been most influential on my thought is I'd recommend Hayek, and to read anything by Hayek, because it seems like he keeps popping up in the back of my head constantly when I look at world events and when I look at what politicians say, because he has a way of analyzing the world and history and politics that's important, and that's important for us who think that the world is open-ended and that societies are works in progress and that things can still improve. So anything by Hayek, it could be law, legislation, and liberty, or the Constitution of Liberty, or the Fatal Conceit, or The Road to Serfdom. All wonderful books if you haven't read it. And the other thing, we've talked about that being impassioned and getting the kind of emotional force of liberty. I'd say read Ayn Rand. Whenever I feel like I'm becoming soft or pragmatic and agreeing too much with, not much can be done about the world, I read Ayn Rand and I get inoculated against that kind of pragmatism, because that's really both her novel and her nonfiction, whether you agree or not. It's a powerful boost of energy, an injection of passion into what is otherwise, say, could be a kind of slow and sad struggle against just fallacies and mistakes. So that would be something to recommend.
Do you have a favorite among her novels?
I'm a Fountainhead guy. I think that's the best novel that really made the greatest impact on me. I love that. Even though Atlas Shrugged is something that you have to read it. It's a very powerful work.
I agree with you completely. I also like Fountainhead a bit more than Atlas Shrugged. All right. Anyways, thank you once again, Mr. Norberg, for joining us today to celebrate our 5th anniversary of Slovak Students for Liberty. I should mention that you can find us on social media, on Facebook or Instagram. If you're interested, you can also join us. You'll find more info on our social media, how to do that. And if you do decide to follow us, you'll be, I'm sure, glad to find that we organize similar events quite often. And you'll also find some older videos, older lectures there. So once again, thank you, Mr. Norberg. If our viewers would like to follow you, if you could tell us where they can find you.
Yes, they can look for Johan Norberg Official in various places, on Facebook and on Instagram and on Twitter. Well, there it's more just Johan Norberg, basically. But if you Google that, you'll find me in various places, and just Google my name, and then you'll find some of the documentaries that I've made and books as well. So yeah. And apart from that, I'll just end from my side to say thank you, Michael, and again, congratulations. And as Jose writes in the chat over here, since he's a Star Trek fan just like me, I'll just say live long and prosper.
Thank you so much. And all of you for joining us. We hope to see you some next time. Engage.